looking at a great masterpiece by Picasso, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon from 1907, or in English, The Young Ladies of Avignon.
MoMA's second most famous painting.
After The Starry Night.
Right, after Van Gogh's Starry Night, and for many art historians, especially modernists, by far their most important painting.
Heralded as the beginnings of
20th century art in so many
modern
ways.
Art, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an extraordinary painting for us to have in New York, but it's a pretty tough painting.
It is. It's still a tough painting. It still looks like, what was he thinking? Some figures look so radically different than others. Yeah. It kind of lacks stylistic unity, right?
Cohesiveness. Yeah. I mean, some people have talked about this as almost a kind of laboratory where the artist was literally just throwing everything in to see what would happen.
It does seem like that, doesn't it?
It's almost as if we're witnessing a kind of experimentation.
And didn't Matisse call it the death of painting or something like that?
Brock hated it.
People were aghast.
And Picasso kept it in his studio and really kept it out of sight for a long time.
Maybe afraid to show it to that many people.
I think that that's true. But Matisse responded to this. I mean, he saw this as a challenge. And in some ways, of course, some art historians see this as a response from Matisse. That is, Matisse had painted The Joy of Life, and a lot of art historians look at this as a kind of response to that great Fauvist canvas.
And certainly not expressing that joie de vivre that we see in Matisse.
He's taken all of Matisse's joy, all
sensuality,
of the pleasure, all of the rich colors, the outdoor
sense
experience,
of nature,
the classicism that was so implicit there,
right.
and he's condensed it. He's made it brutal. He's brought it inside.
Interior.
He's made it contemporary.
He's brought in African and ancient Iberian art.
That's right. Archaic art. There's lots of stories and lots of anecdotes behind this painting. Maybe we should talk a little bit about what's being represented.
Well, we have 5 women who are understood to be prostitutes.
In a brothel.
And in the early sketches, Picasso had depicted, because there were many
lots
sketches.
Of studies, even though this looks like a sketch in many ways.
Yes, it's not at all. It was very, very carefully thought out. So in the early studies, there's a male figure walking in from the left who was identified, I think, by Picasso as a medical student, right?
That's
and
right.
He's carrying a medical textbook and a skull, and he's walking into the brothel, and so there's a way that figure now is removed from the painting, it doesn't appear, and the figures seem to instead be addressing themselves to us, to the viewer, directly.
That reminds me of Manet. If you go back to 1863, you look at Olympia, you have a courtesan looking directly out at the viewer becomes the customer.
Right.
And Picasso is clearly aware of this.
Yes, and these 5 women acknowledge us. So this has often been called the first Cubist painting.
Or the
proto-Cubist.
Proto-Cubist, exactly. And I think we see that in the relationship between, well, first of all, the figures themselves are violently rendered. They're almost like shattered pieces of glass.
Yeah, they're very angular.
They're sharp, and they look a little bit dangerous. But I think what a lot of art historians look at is the way that they are really embedded rather than being in front of the ground. That is to say, the figures in the ground are really linked, really merged in a way.
There's no sense of volumes in an empty space, but rather space itself has a kind of palpable presence to it.
I think, that's a great way of putting it, absolutely. One of the ways I've looked at it is almost fragments of glass in a stained glass window, where there's a kind of tremendous compression
on that
same
simple
plane. That's exactly right. Even as there's also references to space, because the woman in the upper right is clearly peering through curtains.
Right.
And so there is this sense of space, but at the same time, she's also at the same plane. And it is very emphatically reminding us of the picture plane of the canvas.
Yeah.
And really disallowing the kind of illusionist depth that had been so powerful. And in that sense, of course, Picasso is again referencing Manet.
And taking a big step toward taking apart that one-point perspective tradition that had been so important since Giotto in the Renaissance, or since Masaccio and Brunelleschi.
So there he's really referencing Cézanne, right? Because one of the ways in which
showing
this is read...
different points of view at the same time.
Exactly, as if we're moving through this space and seeing these women, seeing these curtains from different perspectives simultaneously.
Right, we're not the single fixed viewer anymore, but maybe a viewer who experiences the space more physically, moving through
more dynamically.
More dynamically.
Absolutely. The painting also it's large, so that the figures are virtually life-size.
Yep.
So there's a kind of palpable quality to that. But then there's lots of other references that are thrown in. You had mentioned African and Iberian. If you look at the two figures on the right, clearly wearing African masks, which Picasso had begun to collect at this point.
And which he identified with a kind of primitivist sexuality or sexual...
kind of danger. Really.
Right. Kind of looking back or looking at African art as having some kind of magical psychological power that he wanted to bring to European painting, I think.
Maybe this is connected to the Courbet idea that somehow the Western tradition had become too civilized and had lost a kind of truth. And if one could go back to this more primitive society, and it's very racist really in many ways, if one could go back to a primitive society, one could reclaim that kind of directness, that kind of truth.
Right.
But then, here's what's interesting, is he doesn't just go to Africa. The figure on the extreme left is taken from a head of an Iberian sculpture that is something from Spain or Portugal, but long
Ancient
before...
Spain,
that's right. Before even the classical tradition, this archaic tradition that Picasso had apparently seen in an exhibition at the Louvre. And so there we have this notion of Europe in this sort of pre-classical mode, in this truer time, when art was more direct.
And so everything that the West held so dear about its progress, about its accomplishments, the realism of its art, all of those things, Picasso, that the West held as great achievements, Picasso tosses out the window.
And that's perfect for Picasso's biography, because remember, Picasso had been a child prodigy. He had learned all of those traditions so easily.
From his father.
From his father. And then he...
Oedipal drama there,
That's right.
maybe.
And of course, this is one of those paintings where early in his career, when he's really rejecting that, and he's really, in a sense, trying to unlearn and create a new visual language that is appropriate to our industrial culture.
I know that there's some interpretations of the central figure standing, but also
Lying
kind of a
down.
reclining figure.
Yeah, second from the left. That is, we can read her both as a vertical figure, perhaps leaning, but also her head on a pillow. The sheet is no longer a curtain now, and Picasso is looking down. Sort of shift of perspective. William Rubin, who is the curator of MoMA for many years, wrote articles about this painting where he talked about Picasso's fear of syphilis, of contracting disease at these brothels, and perhaps the notion of these women as other, representing that fear.
Right, and also the power that the women had over him, that the sexual desire
because
had
Picasso
over him as women.
did visit these brothels.
And a sort of fear that kind of desire caused in him.
Yeah, and perhaps that was the primitivism that Picasso was looking at.
Maybe in himself.
Yeah.